Welcome to tonight's Film Studies Online discussion. We will be talking about Cat People from 1942, and I sincerely hope that you had a chance to watch the introduction by Jennifer Fleeger and her usual company of supporting cast and crew. And Jennifer is here with us to share her insights for and interest in the film. Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hey, I'm fine, thank you.
Good. In case you are new to our discussions, please remember to keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question. The way you will know it is your turn to ask a question or make a comment is I will call on you, and I will know to call on you because you will use the raise hand function in Zoom as indicated on the diagram on the screen. And we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat window. You can also sort of make comments to other participants there as well. And if you are from outside the greater Philadelphia area, we would love to hear a bit more about where you're from and what you think of our program. So please visit the Where in the World section of Film Studies Online at our website, brynmarfilm.org. And we'd love to hear from you and hear how you think we're doing. Comments are welcome from anywhere, but we're particularly interested if you are from outside this area. And let's see, we have a couple of our regulars who are starting us off right away. So let us begin with David. David, how are you this evening?
Now that I'm able to unmute, I'm fine. And thank
Good.
you. Jennifer, as my first part of my little soliloquy here, you'll have to tell us whether your son gets scale or not for these performances. More important, I would like you to follow up a little bit. We understand the low budget and we understand a lot of the stuff that you've given us and some of the reviews, but I would like you to talk about how they were able to take such simplistic scenes and make what at least appear to be relatively good dramatic shadow effects, between the psychiatrist's office and some of the other places. And then I would love to hear your view on Dr. Judd, just to pick one of the thought processes here, and his methodology, which one of the reviewers called the Vincent Price School of Therapy, and how he got into that role. Great choice, very different than many of the others. I didn't used to be a horror film buff, but the couple that you've given us in this one, really happy about it. Thanks.
I'm super glad to hear all of those comments, David. My son gets paid in cookies, which is a quality payment method, I think, for all children. And I actually have a feeling that Andrew will be better at answering the question about style than I am, because I don't really know all that much about film noir or where the stylistic effects at RKO came from. Andrew and I were talking before the chat about how the staircase was used in Magnificent Ambersons. And it was actually used in a couple of other RKO horror films too, including the sequel to this one. So we see some overlap there and reuse of some techniques. But Tourneur had a lot of experience making other films that have a dark nature to them. Just last night I was watching Out of the Past, which is 5 years later than this, but has absolutely really sleek and gorgeous shadows throughout that one. So it became a stylistic trademark for him. I'm trying to remember what some of your other questions were, but Andrew, maybe you can help with the question about how do the shadows still look so good, even though this film is so cheap?
Yeah, the other was the Vincent Price School of Psychiatry.
Oh, yes.
If you want to jump in on that.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, do you want to answer the Vincent Price question first, or do you want me to?
Janice in the chat says she has to say that was the worst psychiatrist ever, and I'm totally on board with this project. Often a psychiatrist in horror films is used as a kind of evil creature or somebody who might have the wrong scientific approach that will then manipulate things in the completely wrong way. So it's not that out of the ordinary for the psychiatrist to have been bad, but that he would be this bad and then actually commit sexual assault is kind of shocking. That's true.
I mean, I don't know if I'm prepared to go so far as to say he's the worst in the history of cinema, because I'll just mention that Hannibal Lecter was a psychiatrist, and he certainly got a higher body count. But I think I think this psychiatrist is an interesting figure for reasons beyond the fact that he carries a sword in his cane, which I thought was rather odd for someone who wasn't, a Bond villain or something. But there's a sort of undercurrent in certain movies. And I think this is probably earlier than these movies, but Jennifer, you're probably familiar with some more of these titles than I am, but movies from the mid to late 40s and into the 50s where there are elements of the female characters, life, makeup, behavior, whatever, that need to get fixed by a doctor. And there's sort of this, power dynamic, because the doctor can read things about and knows things about this person that she doesn't even know about herself. I think about movies like Possessed, with Joan Crawford and others, where there's the sort of the medical knowledge and the sort of, the sort of high social station and professional station kind of gives the psychiatrist authority over the woman. And frankly, this guy in this film takes all sorts of liberties that are inappropriate long before he begins to sort of try to assault her, in terms of, and the thing is though, is some of these, I mean, discussing her case with her husband and his new girlfriend in a cafe is problematic. Although if, I don't have any firsthand experience, but if Mad Men is to be believed, there was a time when mental health professionals would discuss a woman's condition with their husband, which I find, deeply troubling. So I don't know if that was had some basis in fact, but the doctor's a problematic figure. There are a lot of these doctors who are problematic as time goes on. And I watched this film on, I saw it on TCM, and they had an author on, and he made the point that starting in around this era, but more often in the post-war era, you start to see psychologists and psychiatrists appear in horror films more. And it's because the sort of notion is that it's not I mean, sure, there's the creature from the Black Lagoon, and sure, there are other outside threats, but the biggest threat is inside us, right? To borrow a line from a movie that wasn't a horror movie that we covered much earlier in this series, Monsters from the Id, right? And if you look at Hollywood in general in the post-war era, and again, this is earlier, if you look at Hollywood in the post-war era, a lot of genre work sort of moves internally, right? You start to have Westerns, you have the psychological Western, right? That isn't about, things that are out there like the law on the frontier, but about the morality and the code internally of the Western hero. And even in film noir, there are, there's the femme fatale who supposedly, makes the male protagonist do the things he does, but there's also something about his internal corruption, motives, weakness, what have you. So psychiatrists have, and the notion of these things being internal, mental or emotional or psychological, is a big turn that Hollywood's making in the middle of the last century. And it largely has to do with the emergence or the entry into popular culture of Freudian psychoanalysis. But that wasn't even anywhere near the question I was supposed to comment on, which is about the shadows. So 1942 is the year after most people would say film noir starts with Maltese Falcon, and what this period, one of the reasons film noir and frankly horror start in Hollywood, noir again in the very early 40s, horror horror had been around, but it really sort of hits its stride in the 30s and into the 40s with movies like Dracula and the Mummy and the Wolfman. The thing that those two genres have in common is the importance of German filmmakers and German technique coming to Hollywood. A lot of people would say the first feature horror film made was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a German expressionist film. A lot of genre directors, noir directors, and more importantly, perhaps cinematographers came from Germany and elsewhere in Central Europe, and they left over the course of the 1930s for obvious reasons. And so the influence of their style, of their technique, sort of lays the groundwork, even if they aren't actually necessarily always doing the work themselves, lays the groundwork for the look of film noir and for the look of horror films like this one. So that's an important sort of historical industrial reason about why those things start to emerge at this time. Okay, Joss, you have a question or comment?
Lots of them, but I'll try to be efficient about it. I'd never seen this before, and I'd heard of it. I vaguely remember having seen Curse of the Cat People on TV when I was a kid, and it was creepy. And so was this. So I'm glad we had this opportunity. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but it was really interesting just because of all the techniques. And also in my reading, I learned that this movie saved RKO Pictures from the financial disaster of Citizen Kane. So this must have been a very successful film with audiences at the time. The other thing that struck me about this was certainly all the techniques of the darkness, and the sound was amazing. It was just so overwrought in a very effective way. But this must have been so influential because I recognized so many things. I mean, several films by Hitchcock come to mind. And I wonder, I mean, Hitchcock was already established by then, although not necessarily in the US. But there were so many things about this that reminded me of Hitchcock. Certainly the darkness and the foreboding, but even specific scenes like the pet shop reminded me of an early scene in The Birds. And there was another scene not so much related to Hitchcock, but there was a scene where where she had been out as the Panther apparently, and there was a dead sheep. And it just struck me that I'd seen that somewhere before, and it was in the film Altered States, a Ken Russell film from the early 80s. And it just suggested to me about all of those things, how influential these filmmakers must have been in spite of their current relative obscurity. Anyway, those are just some of my observations, and I would certainly love to hear any comments that the two of you have.
Well, thanks, Joss. Jennifer, did Joss make you think of anything in particular to comment on?
Yeah, I loved your comment about the pet shop scene and the birds. I also think that the scene right before the bus where she's being followed by Irena, who becomes a Panther maybe, is a lot like The Man Who Knew Too Much. There's some following scene work in that with the Doris Day version and the earlier one too. It reminded me of that. But there's other things that happen here too that your comment reminds me of in terms of establishing techniques for horror cinema. If I'm remembering the 30s or Universal horror films like Svengali or something, we do see the monstrous figure relatively early on in those movies. And here we're really left wondering until the end. And even there, the Panther's kind of far away, or we get it in shadow. It's a lot more reminiscent of something like Jaws, where you hold back the revelation of the creature so that we can imagine some kind of psychological causes and then be affected ourselves psychologically. So I think that too is also an influential move that this film is making in terms of horror.
This was RKO's highest grossing film that year. And they did take a loss on Citizen Kane, as you said, and it obviously as well outgrossed the film it borrowed its staircases from, The Magnificent Ambersons, Wells's follow-up to that. And it was enormously popular because what I've read says it was made for about $135,000 and it brought in $4 million, which was a very good return on investment, particularly for a studio like RKO. So that would have, I mean, that's the horror's always been that genre that, because the most effective versions of it are often based on what you don't see and either what you imagine or just what you hear, and making us hear something is a lot less expensive than making us see something. And if you think about some of the most profitable films in Hollywood history, one from more recent decades comes to mind, The Blair Witch Project, or Paranormal Activity. Very, very profitable films that have designed their low budget look into the sort of their reason for existing or their premise. So this is a genre that has been doing that for decades and continues to. And that's part of the reason why we don't talk about a lot of them. We don't think about a lot of them sort of in the grand scale of cinema history, but there are a lot of horror films made by Hollywood over the decades. And it's because they're very good. They're very good business, basically. Meredith, you have a question or comment?
I do. I was also wondering about this movie as a predecessor to other films, because it made me immediately think of The Tenant, which has this like very elegant staircase that is also like a creepy and dark staircase. But I was thinking in particular after Judd is killed, when the neighbors are just like, they're so weird, they're just like, don't you know not to touch the body? Like there's no horror, there's no shock. Their reaction just struck me as really strange. But I also just wanted to know like what you thought about this. I thought it was very interesting that I feel like Irina has this very perfectionist streak from the beginning. Like she's throwing away sketches, she's sketching over and over. And Oliver is also very precision oriented, very detail oriented. And so is Alice, like that's their profession. So I just kind of wondered if there was anything to that, like they seem very repressed, basically. That's what occurred to me.
Jennifer, thoughts on the non-sexual repression?
I think what you said about the staircase and the grandness of things is super typical of how horror films have to first establish for us the general groundwork and the nature of what might be lying underneath. And this film does that really well by the comment that he makes about what's behind the brownstone, and by the idea that the animals are there, but they're in cages. Everything is stable. Our litter is being picked up. See, there's a sign here. So as long as everything is staying within its box, the world will carry on as it's supposed to within the context of this particular horror film. And it will only unravel when things come outside of their boxes, when the perfectionism is escaped. But Irena, at the beginning, she shows, I think you're right, like her house is very organized and detailed and intricate. She has patterns on her walls. She has sculptures and things like that, and she's careful with her drawings. But that beginning shot, she throws away that drawing on the ground with the litter, even after being told not to, and then leaves it there. And the camera then sees the drawing and allows us to understand that she's trying to destroy some, eventually we'll see, inner part of herself or her psyche by stabbing the panther. But she's just been told not to litter, and they both leave the drawing on the ground. So it seems like there's more to be done with that moment in the film and the perfectionism of all the characters and the spaces, that maybe this gesture is the thing that unlocks the problem. And it's only happening because she and Oliver have come together, potentially breaking the repression that was allowing everyone to stay in their place. So yes, I think you're right about these tendencies.
And I can't help but think that there's some connection between the sort of the litter and the lesson about the litter in the beginning, and the fact that so much is made of her being an immigrant. I understand that you could imagine the makers of the film saying that, she needs to be from this other culture, so we can explain why she has this heritage that the other characters, that is new to the other characters. But at the same time, couldn't her parents or grandparents have been from another country, and you know, she's always been raised with this? I think there's, you know, I can't quite sort of wrap my head around it, but I think there's something with it coming out when it does in 1942, and what's going on in the US and the world. And because as we were talking before the discussion started, and Jennifer made the very good point that, you know, there's that whole thing with the litter isn't just there so we can see Oliver make a basket, right? There's something there, and there's that's the most detailed and moralistic littering sign I've ever seen. And so, you know, what is that? And this is an example where I certainly haven't figured it out, but I think there's something there. I think there's a reason that was there, and I have to believe it's connected to her sort of being, you know, the film telling us she's new to the country, I guess. Let's see, William, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have a comment. So one thing I find interesting with horror is always how there's a psychological underpinning that sort of reflects the times. And in this case, I was thinking of how the quote unquote good girl and the hero have this very sort of platonic, supportive relationship. It's not really as romantic as we see in other movies before this time. And I was thinking maybe that had to do with how the war was raging and how the film was trying to send this message of, you see, you can have a beautiful relationship if you simply support your man.
That's interesting. I mean, I always think that there is, you know, films are affected by the historical moment and cultural context in which they're made, sometimes in ways that people recognize at the time, but usually in ways they don't. And one of the challenges with these things only becoming sort of clearer in retrospect is that, you know, I'll speak for myself, I don't have the detailed knowledge of the period, and certainly not the personal experience that might make more sense of this. But I think you might be onto something there. I think there is, I mean, she's from, you know, the other thing too, of course, is we could be overthinking this, right? And it could be, you know, Frankenstein, the Frankenstein movie at Universal was a big success. The Dracula movie at Universal was a big success. I can't remember where the Wolfman is set, but that was a big success. So maybe they just wanted, for commercial reasons, some tie to Eastern or Central Europe. I mean, it could be that basic, but given that it comes out after the US has entered the war, it seems like that might be an avenue to explore as well. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts?
I think this could be a good explanation for this romance, because there has never been a couple with less chemistry than Oliver and Alice, although Oliver has no chemistry, I think, at all. So I guess that would be impossible for him to have it. But you don't really believe, I don't think, in that as a love story. But that speech that she gives about what love is essentially like, you wake up every day and you keep on going, and you and me, and here we are. You know, it's not really very inspiring, and she doesn't deliver it very passionately. But if we take your comment, William, the idea that you just persist through this hard time and stick by your man, then it does kind of make a little bit more sense why that dialogue bit is in there, and why we ought to invest in that romance at all. I'm not sure about it as an explanation for the immigrant aspect, but it certainly explains that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are so many odd things about their dynamic. And the thing I find interesting is that, you know, like often happens in movies in general, particularly movies of this era, they fall in love very quickly and they decide to get married very quickly. And that seems in a way sort of very dated. The sort of question of divorce and annulment, that to me seems in its way dated. The thing that seems extremely contemporary to me is that Rena is sort of jealous of his work wife before she knows that he actually has romantic feelings for her. And that seemed to me to be sort of, you know, a very sort of contemporary development, and almost as if she notices the intimacy between them and the things they share that he doesn't share with her, which is, of course, a certain kind of infidelity. But it's funny because, you know, he doesn't have chemistry, but at least he talks about couple type things with Alice, where he doesn't really with Irina, unless it's, you know, about, you know, hey, what's this statue in our what soon to be home, that sort of thing. So it's a sort of an odd dynamic, and the film, I think, sort of, you know, sets up a challenge for itself, and this is probably one of its shortcomings, that, you know, they're close enough to get to for him to say that they're in love and for them to agree to get married, but not close enough for him to have thought about, you know, why is she drawing panthers being stabbed by swords, for example. So you know, it's not a perfect movie, and I think Jennifer was very upfront about that in her introduction. But there are interesting things about it, and I think that's why it's worth talking about. Although it would appear not many of you do, because we are completely out of questions in a record 26 minutes after starting. So you know, this could be a world record short discussion for us, unless someone else has another. There we go. All right. David and Joss, I appreciate it. I knew you had more to say somewhere, and you're always kind enough to limit yourselves when you first come up. So I will get to you, but first, let's hear from Kate, whom we haven't heard from yet. Kate, comment or question?
A conjecture, actually.
Oh.
This is one of my favorite movies. I just love it. And I couldn't really tell you why, but I just love it. When Irina comes back from her second session with the psychiatrist and she says, I'm no longer afraid. I'm going to be your wife now, not in those words, but I'm no longer afraid. But the husband has already declared his love for Alice, and poor Irina gets shut out. But do you think if she were not afraid and they were able to consummate their marriage, that she could have lived a full life after that, or would she still have turned into a panther?
Jennifer, do you want to take this first?
I think the reason that she became not afraid, if I remember right, in that moment is because the doctor instructs her to forget her entire past, which I read as just assimilate to the American way of life and get rid of everything that might remind you of Serbia and King John and this story about the witches, essentially, and the cat people. And so I think the film is putting up for us that in order to live a successful and happy life, she has to no longer have any kind of immigrant identity. And so I guess that would have been a possibility, but I don't think that is something that she's willing to do, or that the warning at the beginning of the film tells us, which says this something about sin clinging to the fog, you know, of the world from eternity or something like that, right? That there's this way in which sin is perpetuated, and it's of course perpetuated with women. And Irina is given every feminine quality in the first 5 minutes of this film. There's nothing left for Alice. She is beguiling. She can change literally the light of the sky. And, you know, in that apartment scene where he's able to somehow fall asleep and not realize what time it is, even though they're not doing anything. She's a smell. She's a piece of music in the apartment. She is a house. She is fashion. She's just everything. And so she's everything that can tempt and torment a man. And so in order to not be those things anymore, she essentially has to no longer be a woman. And I'm not sure that that's a possibility that the film is able to offer us, I guess. But that's a great comment.
There've been a couple of comments made in the chat. One is, you know, I was sort of flipped for about how quickly they fall in love, and I don't normally have much patience for that comment when other people say it, because it's just a conceit of the movie and movies like this. So that was really just an obnoxious comment by me and not a real criticism. The other thing that's coming up in the chat a lot is people asking us to compare it to the 1982 version. And I cannot do that because I have not seen the 1982 version. My understanding is it's significantly different, if only because, well, two reasons. One, it was made by Paul Schrader, so that should tell you something right there. And two, in 1982, there would be virtually no limit on what the film could depict. And to me, that would make it a very different animal, if you'll pardon the pun. Jennifer, have you seen the 82 version?
Yes, a long time ago, and I don't particularly like it because it does too much. And the whole glory of this film is that it does nothing at all, I think, and that's why I like it. Paul Schrader is a person who has written about spiritual cinema, yet somebody who I don't really think makes very spiritual cinema. So I have always issues with him. And once I was at the University of Iowa and he came to give a talk and he was absolutely drunk and it was not good. So I'm not a big fan of Paul Schrader for these reasons. But I guess one could compare them and imagine what it would be like to make an erotic version of this film. I guess in which you would have to give Irena all of the erotic qualities that this film is only suggesting she have in the stylistic aspects, which is what I like about it.
Yeah, I mean, to me that there are some stories that where you need the ability to be more explicit, whether it has to do with language or violence or sex or whatever. But I feel like, as we were saying before, and as most people seem to sort of generally understand, for horror and suspense, the constraints of not being able to show things more often than not works in the film's favor. And sort of all of a sudden, when you have every kind of option at your disposal, it can lead to things being sort of diluted. Let's see. Janice Glussman, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi, Andrew. Thank
Hi.
you for this. This is a fun discussion. It was such a weird movie, but I was thinking about the weirdness of their wedding dinner at this Serbian restaurant. And, you know, how she said she didn't have any friends at all. So they were all his friends, as well as Alice, who's sitting right next to him, which was kind of weird. But, you know, when that cat woman got up and stopped and said something, I guess it was in Serbian or some language, that just was so freaky. And David thinks that he read something about a lesbian relationship between insinuation between Irena and this strange Serbian woman. So maybe people want to comment on that, or you guys have some thoughts. And the swimming pool was the other thing that I think we haven't talked about. And I thought that was such a creepy, brilliant scene. So thank you.
Well, we talk about what we didn't talk about, since I'll just throw it in for you, is that last scene with the transition from the in and out of the Panther, if you want to add comments there.
All right, thank you two. So, Jennifer, the odd encounter and indeed the whole odd experience in the restaurant for the celebration dinner.
So the woman says Moja Sustra or something like that, my sister. And I think this woman is in the film because she looks like a cat. I think that's why they hired her. I think it's just supposed to be a creepy moment. However, I don't think that lesbian assumption is off at all for this reason. The whole illusion here throughout the film is that there were witches in this village where she comes from in the 16th century. And this was, not that there were witches, but of course, as all of you know, that the burning of witches was a thing that did happen in Europe, and it happened in far greater numbers than most of us assume, certainly far more than in Salem, Massachusetts. There were thousands of women who were killed for witchcraft accusations. And the women who this happened to were participating often as midwives or other kind of people who did medical acts, who something went wrong and so they blamed the woman. They were sometimes lesbians. They were often young adolescent women who were, you know, maybe doing things that weren't quite predictable or feeling kind of hysteric about things, as adolescents are known to do. And so just having that as the backstory, I mean, she says this thing about cat people. Of course, RKO gave the title of the film Cat People, and they came up with a script about it. But what we're really talking about worshiping Satan and bowing down to him is the history of European accusations of witchcraft. And that's what we're associating her with. And because of that, there is this kind of lesbian element that hangs over all of that stuff. But also, of course, she's afraid of having sex with her husband. Why do you think that is? I mean, there are other explanations for why she might want to do that come to light really pretty quickly if you think hard enough about it. So yeah, I don't think you're far off with that one at all.
Yeah, first I found it extremely odd that Oliver had only his coworkers at his at their wedding dinner, and that I understood she were to think she doesn't really know anyone in the U.S., I guess, or in that city. Um, and I thought it was odd that he doesn't have any friends outside of work. But then it occurred to me that it's such a low budget movie that if you already cast these people and these are already people you're paying to have speaking parts, why not just have those be his only friends? I mean, the film is so short and so efficient, right? That why have extra people? Why have to take the time to explain, oh, this is my friend from college and this is my friend from, wherever. Why not just have it be the people we've already seen that we know him, because they're really ultimately fairly inconsequential. Barbara and Richard Hirsch, you have a question or comment?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm really interested in looking at this film as a product of its time. And I want to go back for a moment to the question of her immigrant status. She's treated very well by people in her home, and yet it was a time when immigrants were not treated particularly well and were not perceived as a positive force. And in contrast to that, we come to know that she is in the embodiment of evil, the embodiment of the evil foreigner, Eastern European. And in that sense, it's similar to Dracula, I think, where it does have this dimension where the West is afraid of being the victim of this foreign East European inherently evil being. So I think on the surface, it looked like it was friendly to immigrants, but I'm reading it as a very negative take on an immigrant woman. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Jennifer, what do you think about that?
I think that goes with the earlier comment about if there was a way for her to have been happy, and the only way for her to have been happy would be to destroy herself. And we know that from the very first image, when she throws away the image of the knife stabbing the panther. She has to get rid of everything in her that connects her to her past. So the psychologist tells her the same thing if she wants to move on. But because the film has established that everything interesting about this movie is connected to Irina's past, then there's nothing else that we can do, nothing that can be done. So it does seem to suggest that the tinge of evil comes from her heritage, not even from her specifically, but from the legacy of women in her village, and there's nothing else to do but to destroy herself. So in that way, I definitely see it as a negative attitude toward immigrants. I mean, she gets treated well because she's pretty, right? So.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, I mean, that her sort of her status as an immigrant, or at least an immigrant from a place that I'm going to assume most of the people she encountered weren't that familiar with, sort of is almost a way that these characters were intended to believe. These characters explain away some of the more exotic aspects of her character, let's say, that it takes them longer to be alarmed by all the cat stuff, like the shredded robe and all that, because they're like, oh, well, she's just from, she's from Serbia, and that's, I mean, the film doesn't come out and say that, but
Serbia, we shred our robes. What do you
do? That's I think that's a thing over there. I don't think that's a thing over there, but that the sort of that oddly mannered sort of behavior that sort of goes through the film, that wouldn't surprise me that if that's there as well. And let's be honest. I mean, she's, for everything that we could say, if we wanted to be cynical about it, for everything we could say that this film says about, if we're to take this film as saying, and we shouldn't take it to say this because many of the people involved with it were either from other countries or were the first generation of people born in America from parents from other countries. But I mean, for all the sort of, let's say negative qualities that the Irina character has as the lone, immigrant in the story, she's a hell of a lot more interesting than everybody else we meet who's not an immigrant, right? And there are things that we would say that that a person would be admirable qualities in a person, whether it's passion or warmth or, care about, whether they're harmful to others, all these things that she seems to have that people like Oliver and Alice and the psychiatrist don't. So, I think it's a more, it's a more complicated sort of depiction and of this notion of the immigrant character than we might automatically think. Jennifer, did you have something else?
Yeah, just to go along with that, I think also your comment about the robe and bringing it back to the question relating it to Dracula and the East, it allows us always, when it's the mystical East, to excuse or question a lot of behaviors, which is important for horror. Is that really monstrous, or is the character just weird? And one of those moments is the bird, right? Why does she open the bird cage? And then if you look at her face, she loves that. It's really like a cat trying to destroy that bird. And having her be from the East, you're allowed to say, maybe she doesn't understand birds in cages, or she's just having a good time, or maybe she really is like a panther and torturing that bird. The motives for things allowed to be put in under question for that reason. And that's not
right.
a practice view of immigrants, I guess.
No, but also, I mean, there's that whole sort of current of not comparable, but analogous thinking regarding women in Hollywood, right? I mean, that in a lot of Hollywood movies, right? I mean, the sort of in movies like, those Joan Crawford melodramas, whether it's humoresque or possessed or whatever, and to an extent film noir, are largely premised on the notion that, women do strange things and they can't control themselves and they want what they shouldn't want, and, which is, and which isn't that far from, that's how they do it over there. I mean, it's on the same spectrum of, of unfortunate, condescending views of people who aren't like you. Joss, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, as long as we had some time, took advantage of it. A few things on the immigrant theme. I just wanted to pick up on something that Jennifer just said, and it's this sort of mysticism. And I think having an immigrant in that character lends some mystery and exoticism that you wouldn't get from someone else. I mean, just imagine if Dracula's character weren't Bela Lugosi and were some guy from the neighborhood in Philadelphia. I mean, it just wouldn't be the same. I also wanted to ask Jennifer if she could comment a little bit more on the Luton bus, which was great. Thank you for tipping us off in your intro. And just an observation about the character of Alice. There was a sort of comfortable familiarity with that character. It kind of reminded me of the secretary, of Sam Spade's secretary in The Maltese Falcon, which, almost had a similar relationship, except that Sam Spade was a much better character than Oliver. Anyway, any comments you have about any of that? Love to hear it.
Jennifer, do you have any further thoughts on the Luton bus?
I think it's just a move that we see all the time, where something that you expect to be scary ends up something that is the everyday. And right now, I can't think of a single one. So if people can think of examples from that and you want to type it in the comments to help Joss, I think that would be helpful. But it's the jump scare where something is going to happen and you're so sure it's going to be frightening and horrifying, and it ends up being everyday. So that's what that term means, and it comes from this film. But I wanted to say something a little bit more about the mysticism that you're mentioning, because there's one aspect of it that I find so fascinating. And it's the little tune that she's humming. So she hums it in the apartment at the beginning when it gets dark all of a sudden, and it makes no sense why it's dark and they're still sitting there in the darkness, right? And then it becomes part of the score over and over and over again. I think I counted 7 or 8 times where I heard the little tune, and it's always associated with Irena, and often when she's thinking about transforming into a panther or cat-like attributes of some kind. But there's one point in this film in which they're in the apartment waiting for her, and we hear the little tune, and you think she's going to arrive. So it's a little bit like the Luton bus, except it's in the score. And then one of the characters goes and pulls the record player arm off, and you realize that it was on the phonograph at that one time. And I love this moment so much because it's just like Laura. You know, Laura, that film from 43, is also a kind of mystical creature. We think she's dead for the first half of the movie, and then she shows up. And that tune, which is called Laura, is also on a phonograph, and the characters take it off. Turn off the tune is something but sweet, or something they say, maybe classical but sweet, and then they remove the phonograph arm. So it's often that women, I think, in classical Hollywood, and this happens in Mankiewicz's films too, are turned into melodies that can then permeate the film in more mysterious ways. And I love that this is the first example of this that I can think of, where it then becomes concrete and the men try to literally destroy it, to erase it in the apartment by taking the arm off the phonograph. Get rid of the mysticism. Now we're down to business. It's science. We have to have her committed. I think that's what happens then.
Yeah, and the person who turns the record off is the psychiatrist in this movie. So that definitely fits. People mention this in the comments, and the thing that I usually feel like in films made in the last few decades, it's not a bus's air brake, it's a cat, right? It's a cat sort of screeching or whatever. That is the thing. Someone in the chat mentioned Alien, right? That you're waiting for this other shoe to drop, and you think it has, but it turns out it's the cat on top of the fridge or whatever that jumps down on the people or what have you. So yeah, it's an important bit of misdirection. And I don't know of an earlier example, but I'm not an early horror aficionado. Someone else may. William, do you have another question or comment?
Yes. So I just wanted to touch on it because I found it interesting, because Irina was compared to Dracula earlier, and I felt that unlike Dracula, Irina does not really seem to be that predatory. Instead, she's almost the reverse in terms of being repressed. And indeed, the main predator seems to be the psychiatrist, who thinks, oh, maybe if I just kiss her hard enough, I can cure her of everything that ails her. And so in that way, I think the film is almost a critique of masculinity in spots, so it can't really fulfill on that at the end.
Jennifer.
Maybe this is why Kate and I love this movie so much, because it's actually a critique of all these horrible aspects that we see. You're right, he's a horrible psychiatrist, and he definitely engages in awful masculine behavior, and he pays the price for it. So unfortunately, so does she. There's the downside. But I guess she returns as a ghost in the sequel, so that ends up okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on, I think, the traditional sort of Dracula figure is the predator. And I think Irina is clearly, she's preyed upon, but she also has some predatory instincts as well, at the very least regarding, birds in cages. And so I think the notion that, I think the question of sort of, the comparison to Dracula is interesting, because we don't typically think, I don't typically think, I'll say, of Dracula as a sympathetic figure. Although if you look at Coppola's version of Dracula, he's very much a tortured soul who is a victim of what was done to him, and that gives him some reluctance about doing it to other people. So there is that. I read the novel so long ago, I can't remember if there's any of that sympathy in the novel or not. But it is an interesting aspect of the character to think about, and whether that helps or hurts the sort of Dracula comparison. Jennifer, did you have a thought on that?
I mean, it just strikes me that what you're saying there is so interesting, because Irena is also, Dracula needs to kill by his nature, and because he's a vampire. And Irena needs to become a panther because it's in her nature, it's in her ancestry. Like she can't destroy that part of herself or she will die. So she must become a vampire. So, I'm not a vampire, a panther. So there is some kind of similarity in those two myths. And it definitely depends on the telling of Dracula, as you pointed out, whether or not we find him sympathetic.
Right. Although it's so interesting, though, because something that I don't think anyone's commented on yet, and that struck me as somewhat odd, was that Irina commits suicide by panther, right? When at the end of the film, when she opens the cage, and I'm sort of not sure what to make of that. I mean, I understand that she has to die for all sorts of reasons of Hollywood at the time and the genre and all that. Because despite the fact that to me she seems like the main character of the film, and indeed the most sympathetic character of the film, she's the monster. But it's interesting that's how she does it.
That was something that Janice wanted to talk about too, right? The ending of the movie. And I don't know what to make of it either, because couldn't we also read it as she's opening the cage she's always wanted to free that panther. I mean, she's been drawn to those keys throughout the film. So does she really know the panther's going to destroy her, or does she just want her own freedom to get all of these panthers out of the American cages?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? That she doesn't, right. I was assuming that she knew that would happen, and there's no reason for us to think that she, we see no evidence that she's like Aquaman and she can communicate with other feline life. So that would say that you're right. She's been working towards that throughout different points of the film, right? We know that she wants to let the other big cats out, and perhaps it's ultimately a sort of a comment on animal nature, or it's an indication perhaps that she's not, she may be a cat person, but she's not a cat, or I don't know. But I think you're right. I was assuming a intention there that we don't really have reason to assume. Barbara, do you have another question or comment?
Andrew, is this?
Yeah.
Richard, go ahead.
No, I didn't know there was more than one Barbara on.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Yes, the Hirsches. Go ahead.
Two questions. One is, someone raised earlier the question about the scene at the pool. I don't know that got commented on, so I'd just like to put that back in play for you to respond to. I thought that was sort of the cinematic high point of the movie, where like the drama and the tension and the little bit of horror, I can imagine an audience reacting to that. The larger question is, I am puzzled by the popularity of the film in its year. There's really no characters here to identify with. The high point of the relationship, with Alice and what's his
Oliver.
name? And Oliver is over a slide rule calculation, and it seems to go downhill from there. Like they disclose intimacy, behind a set of boxes in the office. And also she knows that he's sort of interested in a girl. She doesn't just fall in love with him after that. And at the end of the movie, they just sort of said, yep, she's dead. Well, at least she didn't lie about it. And they kind of walk away. So I don't know who the audience would identify with in a movie like this. And I'm puzzled to know whether such films historically in that period would have been part of a double feature. I'm not saying that they came to see something else and this was, the second movie, but I'm just curious what it was, if you can hypothesize or if you know, that would have made this so attractive.
Well, that is a really interesting question. I think that we should keep in mind that it is a very popular genre at the time, that Universal's horror films throughout the 30s have made a killing, if you will, at the box office. And this is intentionally trying to capitalize on that. I mean, the Wolfman and Cat People, there's a clear sort of connection there. So I think you don't want to underestimate the genre. To my knowledge, and I am not an expert on this, to my knowledge, there was a practice, and in some cases there still is a practice of what amounts to block booking, which is saying that distributors would say to a theater that they didn't own, if you want to show this movie that we have, you also must agree to run these other movies that you don't really want, but we're going to make you take them so you can get this one. I don't get the sense that RKO was in a position to do that, at least not in 1942. I also don't get the sense that that double features were sort of prescribed at that level. And I think, frankly, I don't know how the box office accounting was done, but the $4 million return to the film, it couldn't have been all because this film was paired with another one. I think that this was a popular genre at the time, and I think that has a lot to do with it. I also think that, and I say this all the time, I know I'm like a broken record, but it's so hard for us to put ourselves in the mind or in the viewing mindset of people in that era. But as we've been saying all night, all of the sort of tricks and neat kind of effects and scary moments in this movie have been done ad nauseum over the last 80 years, but they hadn't been done ad nauseum in 1942. And if you were like me and you saw this and you found it generally chilling when she when the psychiatrist approaches her and we sort of get that close up of her face and we wonder what she's going to do to him, I found that genuinely chilling. Even now, 80 years later, I found the scene in the pool that you'd like us to talk more about genuinely chilling and thoroughly effective. And so, I think if 21st century Andrew, who's seen plenty of movies, including ones with budgets like hundreds of times the budget of this one, found those to be effective now, I can only imagine how the audience word of mouth for people who were interested in this sort of movie would have been then. It wasn't critics that made it popular then, it was audiences. Jennifer.
I think that it's possible to enjoy a movie without necessarily identifying with anyone. A lot of horror movies I watch, I don't necessarily, the characters are often doing very stupid things and I don't want to identify with them, so I resist doing that. This one in particular, there is a film scholar who collected a bunch of comments by women who saw it at the time about why they liked it. And I can try to look that up for you and send it to you after if you really want to know why people at the time were interested in this one, but it was women in particular. And I think that even though Irena is like weird and does strange things and has hangups, I do kind of identify with Irena, especially in the moment that Andrew mentioned where the psychiatrist is attacking her. She's gonna get him, and that's a moment that every woman wants to see, finally sticking it to the guy who's gonna do something horrible to her. So there's something there, I think, in terms of what women might have wanted to see, even though it's drawing on the traditionally masculine genre of the horror and its association with animals, as Andrew pointed out. The pool scene, I think, is absolutely fantastic. It's the best scene in the movie. I would totally agree with you. And it's so minimal. That's what makes it so great. It's just sounds and a little shadow that's animated on the wall that maybe looks like waves and kind of looks like a panther. But the echo effects all around the room in that moment, the absence of music, and the fact that we never really know where we're located, that our perspectives keep shifting, just like Alice's in the pool would be if she can't really locate herself. I think all of that makes it so effective. And the fact that she's trapped there. She jumps into the water and then there's nowhere else she could go. She's just there in the water. So we're just waiting for something to happen. It's a wonderful moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant idea to set that scene there, right? Of all the places that we could have that character have this encounter with what is or isn't following her or stalking her. It's brilliant for all the reasons Jennifer said. And of course, the whole time I was thinking is how smart she was to be in the center of the pool, because don't cats hate water? So, there's that element to it as well. But the auditory and the visual options available to them as filmmakers in that, having it set in that room was absolutely brilliant, I think. Lillian, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I've been listening to all of this, and I suspect I'm a lot older than many of you, but I saw this movie when I was a kid. And when you announced that it was the movie of the week, I thought to myself, oh my God, that was a really scary movie. And I still remembered seeing that movie and thinking it was a very scary movie. I mean, I was too young to unpack it in any way as has happened this evening, but I've listened to all of this and I've been thinking to myself, when I saw it the second time and I watched it twice and I said to myself, so what were you so scared about? You know, because at this juncture in my life, although I understand all the things that were talked about this evening, I'm now reacting to the question about, you know, what did people see in this movie in its day? You know, we used to go to the movies every Saturday afternoon. It was the thing that people did, youngsters did. We didn't have television, we didn't have any of that stuff. So that movies like this, I think, provided a different kind of entertainment. And I'm not a horror movie lover particularly, and in a lot of ways I avoid the current horror movies because they're a little too much for me. But I just really needed to add this comment to everything everybody was saying tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Lillian. That's the sort of, you know, the sort of firsthand experience or insight that, you know, not everybody can offer. And I think it does add a lot because, you know, this is something that stuck with you for many years and something you chose to see. And that's something that, you know, for most of us who are just coming to the movie now because of this discussion, can't bring to it. So thank you. David, you have another question or comment?
Well, we were talking about the cats, and you know, it's not all of the cats that she associated with. It was the panther, and there was that one a comment about the biblical reference, and I didn't get a chance. Now that I'm thinking about it, I was going to go look it up. Do either of you know where that whole reference came from, and whether that led into it's just the panther? She's not, you know, she didn't let the other cats out of the bag, out of their cages, and it's only the one cat that she is.
I mean,
Yeah, I can't offer anything about the biblical angle.
somebody commented in the chat that it's in Revelation. I don't know, but if you think about the panther and it's black, like the Black Sabbath and the devil and these things that we're associating with at the beginning, that also makes sense. Why it wouldn't be a tiger or a leopard or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, and it's not that the film is necessarily going for subtlety, but having her walk around in a black coat that makes her outfit resemble a panther is a lot more credible than having her walk around in a tiger print or leopard print coat for the whole movie and have us supposed to sort of take her, you know, seriously, I guess. Let's see, William, you have another comment or question?
Yes. So I was just thinking also about why the film was so popular, and I think it's just because it sort of represented a perfect combination of various things that were popular at the time. So for one, there was obviously the horror, and then for other, there were all these films coming out around the time about like, what did it mean to be a woman? I'm thinking like 37, Stella Dallas, what does it mean to be a mother? Then later in 45, we got Mildred Pierce again, what does it mean to be mother? And then in 1942, there was the film called I Married a Witch, about a woman who's a witch who romances Frederick March. So this film is sort of like a perfect zeitgeist movie.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to get at that earlier, that there's some connection here to the sort of run of melodramas or so-called women's films that were popular from the late 30s, mid to late 30s, you know, well into the 50s, and you laid out some good examples of that as well. Jennifer, do you have any last comments on that comment or anything else?
I like the idea of connecting it to melodrama because, of course, horror and melodrama, as a film scholar named Linda Williams points out, have similar aspects in that they make us do something with our bodies. We weep or we jump. And in this case, you do kind of want to do both, I think. I'm mourn Irena when she's gone. She was the most interesting part of the film. She struggled a lot. She never got what she wanted, and there she is, you know? So there's a sadness at the end of the movie, and I do think it has a lot of similarities to those other more traditional types of women's pictures. That makes a lot of sense to me. I also, I loved Lillian's comment about going to the movies when she was young, and we don't always choose to see something because we think it's going to be amazing as a piece of art, right? Like sometimes it's just there and it triggers something in that moment for us that's helpful or interesting. And I imagine that was probably true for a lot of people.
Lillian, did you have one final comment? No, you just put your hand up in solidarity because yeah, you would employ the same approach to moviegoing that Jennifer just described. That's great. Thank you all for joining us. As always, I think we had a great discussion in large part because of your comments. If you love what Jennifer brings to discussion of films and filmmakers, you don't want to miss the seminar she's offering tomorrow night on Dorothy Arzner, the groundbreaking woman director in the early years of the studio system. That's tomorrow night. 2 weeks after that, I am offering a seminar on post-World War II American political films. And you can find out more about these in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. And we'll be announcing later in the week a number of other seminars coming up. We'll also be announcing in our Thursday email next Monday's film to be discussed. And if you want to know what we have coming up, whether it's future discussions, the latest Ask Andrew segment, or our remote classroom seminars, you can certainly visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. You can also sign up for our emails, and everything will be sent, notice of everything will be sent right to your inbox. And if you like what we're doing and you have the means, we would very much appreciate your financial support. Please visit brynmarfilm.org. And make a donation if you can during this time. We are working hard to get our doors open, but we can't guarantee when that will occur, and we have to have movies to show as well. And that day is coming. We're working on it. It's coming. But until it does, every little bit of support you can provide is much appreciated. And we want to be there to hit the ground running when we can reopen, and we know you want that too. So please consider making a donation at brynmarfilm.org. Until we see you next week, hopefully, for the discussion of another film. I'm sure you join me in thanking Jennifer. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us and suggesting this movie. A great choice, and worth it alone for what you brought to the introduction. I mean, using 2 different video stocks. I mean, Oliver Stone would be so proud. Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's always a pleasure. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.